thanks everyone for coming. This is kind of an exciting talk to give because it's to a group of people I wouldn't normally get to talk to, given everyone's so far flung. And also, this is almost the topic, working on technical language, or as I've been calling it, jargon. This project is almost exactly a year old, where I gave the first look at it about a year ago in the conceptual engineering seminar. So I'm sort of excited by the symbolism, given that it's kind of come full circle, and now I've been able to like apply this work in a really cool way. So basically the goal of the talk today is to give a sort of like an attempt to say, what can we do with the tools of conceptual engineering? What can we do with the tools of philosophy of language and apply it to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic? I think that's my default as a philosopher. If something's bothering me in my life, I try to do philosophy about it, and I'm currently stuck inside, so I've tried to do philosophy about it. And so I'm going to start by sort of giving an introduction and embedding this talk a bit in conceptual engineering. So as I said, I'm interested in jargon, technical language, as Manuel Gustavo called it. And one of the reasons I am interested in it in this context is it provides a really rich set of case studies for conceptual engineering. There's like this nice rich corpus that conceptual engineers can use to better understand what it is they're trying to do. And first off, jargon is often teleological. Not always, but sometimes, most of the time, it's introduced. If we have this technical language, it's introduced to fulfill some end, whether it's adding expressive power to language, having some thought, being able to talk about some theory that we otherwise wouldn't be able to. Jargon often involves the development of new concepts. There's no concept of quasar before specialists developed the concept of quasar and called it quasar. So you see these cases where like a new jargon often involves meaning change. So think about the change of atom from the ancient Greek use, meaning the smallest possible, or the smallest thing, to the modern use, where an atom is something that's composed of something. And you might notice here too that the way I'm using jargon in this case, it's not a very clear cut. It's only used in specialized circumstances. In fact, this is something that often moves back and forth from specialized to everyday language. So atom started its life out in sort of Greek metaphysics, and then early Renaissance, or early Enlightenment, early Renaissance physics, and then became a fairly common word. The same thing happened with meme, DNA, laser. These are all, there's this like nice fluid motion back and forth from one community of speakers to another. And along these lines, the history of jargon is a history of successful meaning and concept propagation, where the introduction of these words into technical settings, and then if they manage to get out into common speech, are places where we see language successfully propagate in the way that conceptual engineers are currently doing a lot of hand-wringing about. And finally, and this is going to be the focus today, which is jargon, because it's like real life examples from that really like affect people's lives, and it very much are things that we have to grapple with as speakers of a language and specialists in a certain subfield. Jargon forces us to think about the relationship that exists between people, language, and concepts. It forces us to think about how is it that all these different parts interact with each other. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today when it comes to the language of pandemic. And so this has been a particularly interesting time to think about this, because COVID-19 has introduced us to a lot of jargon terms from epidemiology, healthcare communication, public health sciences, virology. And so this is my attempt to build something like a comprehensive list of jargon terms that have entered the everyday English lexicon in the last couple months. COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus, social distancing, physical distancing, flattening the curve, herd immunity, immunocompromised, N95 masks, PPE, ventilators, intubation, respiratory failure, and asymptomatic. And so these are all cases where like there's been this really rapid knowledge transfer and linguistic transfer from one community, specialized community speakers, to everyone. These are some of the most common words in the English language now. And so you might worry like, Ethan, asymptomatic, that's not really a jargon term. Well, let's look at Google Trends. So let's look at Google Trends data for asymptomatic definition, ventilator definition, herd immunity definition, what is a respirator, and social distancing definition. This is from 2019 to currently. So this is the amount of which the relative amount of which people were searching these. This is over the last 90 days. And so we see that people have really been confused about what these terms mean in a way that they haven't been in the past. And actually what's really cool about the bottom graph is you can track how, as different things have happened, different jargon has become prevalent. So in early March, when the lockdowns were starting, that's when social distancing peaked. Then as the curve started reaching their peak, that's when ventilator searches peaked. And now that we're worried about like how much the rate of asymptomatic people and how that affects when lockdowns are lifted, we're seeing asymptomatic peak now. And so so I'm going to look at two problems today involving language and jargon. And one is, what do we name the virus? And so in the original coining of the name of the virus in a virology journal, dubbed it SARS-CoV-2. It's actually a preprint currently. The virus is named SARS-CoV-2 because of its relationship to SARS, although there was a bit of hand-wringing in the original journal that the name would cause people to confuse it with SARS. Actually, which is now SARS-CoV-1. And actually the WHO was similarly worried about SARS-CoV-2 being confusing. And so they decided to call the virus COVID-19, which was originally only the name of the disease. And so the WHO, as an attempt to reduce confusion, limited the expressive power at its disposal by choosing to conflate the virus and the disease, and which is something we sometimes do with like the flu, but not with things like HIV and AIDS, where we make this distinction between the disease and the virus that causes it. But at the same time, on top of this, there's this common name, coronavirus, that is much more common than either of them, and that was neither from the original baptism of the name of the virus or the name of the disease. So coronavirus comes from the name of the family of viruses. So this is the relationship that coronavirus has with the family, is the same that like cats have with feline or we have with great apes. And so coronavirus is the name of the family kind, which is the same as like retrovirus, which is the same level as retroviruses. So what's happened is the common people, normal people, have misused this technical term, this technical evolutionary cladistic term, and used it as the name for a virus. And so there's some question, and I think there's reason to suspect like, hey, maybe this is something we should correct. And as we go through the talk, I'm going to give you a framework to thinking about whether or not using coronavirus in this case is okay, even if it is a misuse of the sort of cladistic name. So the other language-based problem is what happened with social distancing. So social distancing, and slightly earlier than that, the idea of increasing social distance dates back to the aftermath of the 2002-2003 SARS outbreak, when when epidemiologists were looking at sort of different strategies that worked and didn't work for slowing the SARS outbreak. And specifically, they used in these early citations and then carrying forward, they were using social distancing to describe methods of reducing contact rates, and were specifically interested in strategies like closing schools, closing gathering places like concerts, closing workplaces. But the concept of social distancing is much older. Like closing a brothel to stop the spread of syphilis is a type of social distancing. Leper colonies are a type of social distancing. So it's a new label to an old idea. And there was a lot of chaos when social distancing started. People were running off in camper vans to the Scottish Highlands. People were hanging out on beaches despite governors and governments trying to close the beach. And it's kind of hard to find interviews from people talking about social distancing at that time, but here too I found. The first is a pharmacist who was interviewed in line at a bar. They said, in my occupation, I'm probably going to be exposed more than the average person. I'm taking precautions, but there's only so much I can do if I have to go to work, right? The idea there being, I'm going to be exposed. What's the point in like going hypervigilant in how I act, which is, as we know, sort of the exact opposite of what you're supposed to be doing in this situation. And then a bartender in Philadelphia said like, well, look, we're using hand sanitizer and I'm not hugging much, is the idea that that's somehow, you know, enough to prevent the spread of the disease. And there's a lot of hand wringing around the middle of March that that language was to blame. So the first quote is from a social psychologist who told the USA Today, if you start practicing social distancing, which we really need to call physical distancing so that people better understand the concept, it highlights the fact that, oh my gosh, this is a dangerous time. And here's a viral media image, viral social media image that I couldn't find the author of despite looking. So, but there's a sense that language is a problem. And in fact, in mid-March, the WHO again made this decision about language where they stopped using the phrase social distancing and started using the phrase physical distancing. However, people did not follow suit. People haven't picked up physical distancing, although governments have, or some governments have. So this is the Canadian government website on social distancing from the 25th March. Here it is on the 29th. So you can see that the Canadian government basically kept saying exactly the same thing, but changed what they were talking about from social distancing to physical distancing. Right, so that's the rough and ready outline. Let's get into sort of the philosophical meat of it. So the outline of today is I'm going to introduce this idea of words having functions. And after introducing a little bit of background of conceptual engineering. And from that idea of words having functions, I'm going to move over to language design, the idea that we can design language and give them certain functions by how we design them. And so I'm going to use Fricker's discussion of sexual harassment as a discussion of this notion I'm calling decipherability. And then from there, we'll have everything in place to talk about epidemiological language design specifically. So I'll be talking about what we want out of epidemiological language, or at least from a philosophical point of view, what I think we should want out of epidemiological language. And then I'll get into actually evaluating coronavirus, and I'll say it's fine. There's reason to think metasemantically. Coronavirus does not mean what people think it means, but that's fine. And social distancing, even though the word means what people think it means, it's actually a terrible label for the name, but even if the underlying concept is fine. So I'll take that framework and apply briefly to conceptual engineering at the end of the talk. Great. All right. So let's talk first about why we use the words we do. So just a little bit of background on conceptual engineers and how they've talked about how like individual choices of word use. It's come up now and then. So Chalmers has a talk on his website where he distinguishes between homonymous and heteronymous lexical engineering, which is the issue of when we engineer these new words, or engineer these new concepts, do we keep the old words? Do we keep old words? Do we give these concepts to old words, or do we use new ones? And that's ultimately this tension between keeping association of old words, or do we leave these associations behind? Do we say that, hey, we're talking about the same thing? Do we signal that we're talking about the same thing by keeping the same word with a new concept? Or do we drop this idea that drop any illusion that there's a continuation of subject matter and give a new word? And Capellan calls this sort of thing a lexical effect, although the idea traces back to Frege and coloring. But these are non-semantic, non-pragmatic effects caused by words. So these are effects the word has on you that aren't reducible to meaning or implicature. So the examples Capellan talks about are brand names. So he once, I forget if this is a book, he told me in person, this idea of the PowerBook is a name of a laptop line by IBM. It's just a proper name. There's nothing, it's not a powerful book. It's just meant to elicit certain feelings in you, and the marketing people spent a ton of time trying to get that name right. You might show allegiance. So by using certain language, by using certain terms instead of other terms, you show that, hey, I belong to this group, or I want to be considered part of this group. And the one sort of Capellan takes the most issue with, but in her paper in the new collection, Sturkin sort of defends, which is redefining terms to exploit existing associations and institutional power, changing the meaning of marriage, but keeping the word the same, so you can still have this big institutional power that's associated with marriage. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about things. I'm going to be talking about a lot about these lexical effects, although not exclusively about things at the lexical effect level. So to butter you up to the idea that there's a function of words, let's talk about why we use words. This is what I mean. Why do we use expression tokens? Why am I saying the words I'm saying currently? And so some of these reasons are semantic. I use COVID-19 to communicate about COVID-19, pretty mundane. Pragmatic, a little more interesting. Trump uses the name Wuhan virus to implicate blame for the pandemic. So he can sort of implicate that he thinks China's to blame by calling it Wuhan virus instead of coronavirus. But also there are these lexical effect levels, like Trump also probably uses Wuhan virus to form mental associations between the virus and China. He's trying to make us connect the two in our head. And that's not necessarily something he's trying to communicate in any like semantic or pragmatic way. Similarly, I'm using the term lexical effect here in part to demonstrate my knowledge of Capellan 18. I'm trying to fit in with a group of conceptual engineers, so I'm using the language of conceptual engineers. But there's also there's this property of expression types as opposed to tokens. So like the term over time, and I want to call these functions. And so again, the semantic ones are pretty mundane. SARS-CoV-2 refers to the virus. That's why it was coined. They needed a name for the virus, so they created this name for the virus. And in some ways, it's the Wuhan virus allows a speaker to deniably implicate blame for the virus. So, if we assume that this was a conscious decision by some conservatives to use the term Wuhan virus, and they were the ones who coined it, they're using the phrase to implicate China while having some deniability, where they can go, oh, no. I didn't actually say China was to blame. It's just from Wuhan. It's the Wuhan virus. That's the name of it. But also you get these lexical effect things where, again, it might have been designed specifically to cause unconscious associations between China and the virus, if you think that the coining was that sophisticated. Or I think another interesting non-virus related example is string. In the context of string theory, communicates features about the theoretical identity. So string theorists, when they're deciding what we call this thing at the heart of our theory, they could have said, well, we'll call it KXR. This nice, like these letters that don't really make any sense, but they chose string. And why did they choose string? Well, they want to help people learn what it is they're talking about. And string does this brilliantly. What does everyone here know about strings? Well, they're long, thin, and small. And two of those things we get through this idea of string, just the name string. And so I want to focus specifically on these functions, this sort of belief level or concept level epistemic-y flavor that these words have, where they're trying to cause changes in our mental representations. So with that in mind, let me check the time. All right, learning from words and language design. Let's look at how it is that we can learn from words. I'm really angry that Lackey stole this title from me, learning from words, but I'm still going to keep using it anyway. So we're going to use this case study. This is most famously in Fricker's 2007 Epistemic Injustice, the idea of sexual harassment. But she gets the case study from Susan Brownmiller's book, where Brownmiller was a feminist in the 1970s, like an active feminist in the 1970s in Cornell, who was present at the coining of sexual harassment and was very much involved in sort of the propagation as sexual harassment moved from the small group of feminists into the sort of the climax of the chapter is the Clarence Thomas Supreme Court nomination, where Anita Hill publicly accuses him of sexually harassing her. And so it's a really great case study because there's all this great detail built in, and I highly recommend it as like this nice case study to look at for concept and word propagation, where it's in enough detail that you can tell that the concept preceded the term. So she talks about them all sitting around talking about the shared experience and then having this aha moment, and then trying to find a name for the term, and then using the term and using it to like change how people thought about behavior in office spaces. And so as this happened, as not necessarily in the first group of people, but as they took it from the small insular community into the larger world, sexual harassment did a number of things. And I'm going to point out 3 specific things that the phrase itself, not the concept, not the meaning of the phrase itself did to help the people picking up the phrase. So sexual harassment teaches the English speaker what the phrase means. Sexual harassment aids in development of a concept. So describing the aftermath, Brownmiller calls it a magic defining phrase. And in helping develop the concept, sexual harassment changes people's perspectives and behavior by making otherwise unnoticed behavior salient and saliently immoral. So let's talk about each of these in turn. These are 3 big points, but they're worth slowing down to talk about. What do I mean by teaches the English speaker what the phrase means? Well, in English and many other Germanic languages, when you have adjective noun phrases like this, the adjective modifies the noun. The adjective tells you what sort of thing the noun is. And so like a notebook, what is a notebook? It's a book for notes. An apartment building, what kind of building it? It's a building within it. This isn't always the case. So you have things like jellyfish. What kind of fish is it? Well, jellyfish aren't fish. Shooting star. What kind of star is it? It's not a star. The Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. What kind of Democratic People's Republic is it? Or what kind of Korea is it? Well, it's not the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So, but sexual harassment does this. It's what linguists call transparent. What kind of harassment is it? It's sexual. It's very clear cut. It's very clean. It tells you immediately what the word means. Skipping to the last point then, so going back, sexual harassment then like immediately tells you hear the phrase for the first time, you're like, what did they mean by this phrase? Oh, it's harassment that's sexual in nature. Boom, sorted. What about this? And I mean to say something very profound and not profound here. We're all in the conceptual engineering literature. Why do we care about changing people's concepts? Well, because changing people's concepts can fundamentally change the sort of thoughts we have, the sorts of knowledge we have, the inferences we can draw. And that's what sexual harassment did. That's what makes sexual harassment such a powerful change in the way we think about the world, and why we should be so excited about engineering concepts and shouldn't be that excited about changing meaning, because changing concepts allows us to fundamentally change the way we interact with the world and think about the world and represent the world. And so that's all I'm trying to say with this point. But what about this one? I think this is sort of the weirdest one, and the one I've been spending ages trying to find a literature that talks about but haven't found it, which is the term sexual harassment aids in the development of a concept. And so what I'm talking about here is that phrases can elucidate, like the phrases themselves, not the sentences the phrases are in, by connecting previously unconnected ideas and thereby forming concepts or conceptual competence. So by hearing the idea of sexual and harassment put together in the way they are, you connect these 2 things together, and in that it helps you form this new understanding of the world, this new conceptual competence. Hey, look, that's what, I've never realized that this thing isn't flirting, it's a type of harassment. And it's really hard for me to give examples of this because they're all going to be really idiosyncratic to you. I can think of a couple times where this has happened, although they're easy to forget about, where, but the phenomena should be familiar. Struggling with an idea, you're not really thinking clearly about a topic. Maybe you're working in a new subject matter, or looking at a new philosopher's paper or something like that. And then someone presents a label for the idea and you have this ah moment where hearing the label, everything just clicks in the right way. And I'm not saying sexual harassment did that for everyone, but there's reason to think in the way she just Susan Brown called a magic divine case phrase, there's reason to think that it had this power in at least some people. So how do we combine all three of these? How can we talk about all three of these things at once? The top one is a relationship between us and the meaning of the word, how we learn the meaning of the word. The second one is between us and the concept that the word is expressing or a vehicle for. How do we, some way in which the phrase can help us learn about this concept that is being expressed by it. And this last one, like, we see the world different. We have a different experience of the world because of this downstream effect of the concept. So I want to introduce a technical notion, some jargon, to describe this. It's not a perfect account, but it's what I have. It's decipherability. And this is the degree to which someone is apt to infer either true or intended information from the term itself, given their other mental representations. So given what beliefs you have, what concepts you have, what conceptual competence you have, what mental imagery or whatever contingent brain stuff you have, how much information is carried in that term. And I say both true or intended information because I want this to include both beliefs. And in terms of intended information, the concepts in the token psychological way that like Carey and Mashery talk about concepts. So they can form either true beliefs or useful or intended concepts or conceptual competence. But this process can backfire. So we don't want to just be talking about decipherability. So swine flu, for example, caused a global crash in the safe pork consumption market. And so there are all these ridiculous stories that come out of the swine flu outbreak. Like Egypt killed like 300,000 pigs of a Christian minority sect, but it turns out that those pigs were like the cornerstone of the trash collection in Cairo. So the trash collection in Cairo like just ground to a halt. But there's this really interesting, there's a quote from the time from a pig farmer which said like, we're about to turn the corner and start making a profit. And someone labeled H1N1 the swine flu, and it just totally took a nosedive. So at least they think that the phrase swine flu like tanked their income. And this isn't the only time this has happened. Diseases are often associated with certain things, like MERS was associated with the Middle East. The coronavirus is still associated with China, and it's caused problems where people have been stigmatized or attacked, or certain industries have taken huge hits. And again, the WHO again is like on the ball here, where they have a document from 2015 where they lay out what should be and should not be used in disease names. So they say we shouldn't use geographic locations, we shouldn't use people's names, we shouldn't use species or foods names, we shouldn't use cultural or industry names, or my favorite, don't use words that incite fear. So you shouldn't call the virus like the death virus. So these are all ways in which, so like this idea that the same thing that led to good things with sexual harassment led to bad things with names like the swine flu. And so let's add a flip side to this in terms of decipherability. There's also, it can be misleading. There's a degree, in a misleading term is a measure of how misleading a term is, the degree to which someone is apt to infer either false or unintended information from the term itself, given their other mental representations. And so this is either a 3 or 4 part relationship, depending on whether you want to include the designer, between a term, the person's mental representations and world, and optionally the designer. And so I don't want to get more specific here than mental representations in the world, because I don't want to step my toes into philosophical debates, contentious philosophical debates. but I'm simply trying to draw the distinction between things that are grounded on what's up here and things that are grounded on what's out there. And so beliefs are mental representations because they're grounded in me. Whether you think concepts are like Fregean or cognitive is going to depend on whether or not you think those are mental representations or something in the world. So it's basically a relationship between between what a term does, what effects it has on my brain and my cognition, and how that fits with the world, and how that even affects the world. So with that, we've got our 3 to 4 players. Let's play the role of the designer and think, what do we want out of epidemiological language? What do we want out of the language of pandemic? Well, ultimately, it's to lessen the impact of a pandemic or an outbreak. That's the basic function of these responses, is figure out how we stop this from being as bad as it could be. And so there's the intermediary. What then we want as an intermediary, as a means to this, is some sort of learned strategy, people the motivation to use these learned strategies for lessening the impact. But like, what about the term? And this is now, we sort of have everything in place, so now we can turn towards specific terms of pandemic. So just a quick brief outline, so show where we've gone so far. I introduced this idea of words having functions and showed the different levels these functions can operate. Then introduced this idea of language design, specifically decipherability, the way in which the word or phrase carries information that we can infer and teach us something about the world. And then more specifically talked just now about epidemiological language design, how we want to lessen the impact and create mental representations in people that do this as means to lessening the impact. So now we can look at epidemiological language. I'm going to tell you why coronavirus, it's fine. Inaccurate, but fine. And social distancing, bad. Should it be called physical distancing? Maybe, but they're probably better names even than physical distancing. Right. So looking at coronavirus. So again, just for the quick outline, what's the problem with coronavirus? Well, in technical settings, if you say coronavirus, what you mean and are understood to mean is you're talking about the family coronavirus, which has as its members many strains of coronaviruses. And so the name coronavirus, at least in technical settings, and probably refers to a family, an evolutionary family, as opposed to a specific strain. And so given how, so like probably putting this the most clearly, the objection here the most clearly, we can take the role of semantic externalists. I know how popular semantic externalism is here at St. Andrews, so I feel obliged to bring it up. What's the semantic externalist objection to this then? Well, if you're thinking in either a Bergian or Kripkean or Putnam way, there's something, the experts have some sort of insight into what the word means, or have the ability to ground what the word means in the way that we don't. So in the case of Berge, coronavirus means, like coronavirus means what the experts have told us, and the experts previously decided it's the family. Or if you're in more of a Kripke-Putnam mood, experts are more likely to know what a coronavirus is, so they're more likely to have accurate beliefs, so we should sort of trust them for that reason, follow their uses. And so because there's this previous use of coronavirus, you might think then that coronavirus already has meaning. It means the family. And our use is strictly speaking false. And so you can actually create sentences then where people say something literally false, thinking they say something true, like scientists are working on a vaccine for coronavirus, is false. People think it's true because scientists are working on a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, but it's literally false because scientists are not working on all vaccines. Or you might say that coronavirus generally causes respiratory distress is true, but it doesn't mean what the speaker means, because coronaviruses, whether SARS, COVID-19, MERS, or even some versions of the common cold are coronavirus, they generally cause respiratory distress. And so really what's happening is people on this sort of objection, and I think I think this is fairly common sense. Like people are saying something false and they don't realize they're saying something false, and that's bad. But what is the function of the pathogen name, given this machinery I've introduced? Well, it's to lessen the impact of the pandemic or outbreak, but we need an intermediary step here for the function of a pathogen name. Like the name of a pathogen isn't going to do this on its own. Rather, it allows people to communicate about the pathogen and lets people say, hey, look, it lets people spread information about it. Say, hey, look, it's spread to here. This is what we should do. Here's treatment. Here are the rates, that sort of thing. And so the important thing here, outcome we want out of this word is not people say true things. It's that people are able to spread ideas relevant to the outbreak. And what do we want here? Like ideally something like an easy to learn word that ideally communicates what sort of pathogen it is and whether the pathogen is novel. Carry just a little bit of information to help give people true information about the pathogen. And coronavirus does this. Coronavirus is composed of two fairly well-known roots, corona and virus. A lot of people are going to struggle to define either one, especially corona, and people are definitely unsure of, I think unless you've like read Wikipedia, people aren't going to know how corona is modifying virus. But they're easily knowable. It has the word virus in it, so it communicates the fact it's a virus. And it's a phrase that hasn't been used widely before. So it's a word that, while had some circulation in like veterinary circles or medical circles when people talking about the common cold or SARS, these aren't things a lot of people are going to know. And so it signals to us that most people that this is something new, because we've never had widespread discussion of coronavirus before. And so what's the verdict here? Well, we've got some good, we've got some bad. The good is it's easy to remember. It has virus in it, so it's decipherable in that way. It offers useful expressive power, and that lets us talk about the virus. But it's bad in that it's a misuse of a term with a pre-existing technical meaning. And as I talked about at the beginning, it conflates the disease with the virus. But really, if we think about the function we want this to play, what's sort of the minimum function we want a term like this, a pathogen name, to play, we really only care about the things in the good column, because it doesn't matter for exchanging ideas about the virus whether or not it's a misuse of a technical term. And it doesn't, given the features of coronavirus, we don't really need to worry about conflating the disease and the virus. So in the case of like HIV, where like the virus sticks around for years before any sort of symptoms arise, there we have a very vested reason in sort of separating out the disease from the virus. But here, there's an incubation rate of, I don't know what the science is now, 7 days or something like this, where you might be asymptomatic. But in all intents and purposes, since you might still be contagious during that asymptomatic stage, it's okay just to treat the disease like the virus in this case. Right, so going a little fast, but that's fine. Gives you more time to ask questions. So let's look then at social distancing. So I went digging into the epidemiological literature to try to figure out sort of the origin of the phrase social distancing. And as I said before, it started off in 2000. The phrase increasing social distance was first used in 2004, and social distancing was first used in 2005 in a paper by Neil Ferguson, who UK people might recognize as that Imperial College guy who everyone cares about now. So it's kind of cool that he was involved in the first use of this term social distancing, and is now like involved in UK government strategy. But it was originally, it's still used in this way. At least I've looked in as far as like 2019, where reducing contact rates in population, that's what they mean by this. And so this is both a group level and a teleological idea, where why do we do it? Why do we reduce group rates? Why do we reduce contact rates to lessen the disease? And this group level thing, in that they're not interested in individual behaviors. They're interested in strategies that can be taken up as policy in order to reduce contact rates. So like these are group level decisions and group level policies. But it's maybe the concept has changed. I don't really have anything to say about that right now, but I want to flag it that the everyday concept, or the way that the idea of social distancing has been communicated to people, is much more individual specific. So it's focused on your individual behavior, what you as a person can do. So the BBAC says no coming in contact with other people unless you have to. The CDC says keeping space between yourself and other people. The WHO website on social distancing says keep a meter distance between you and people coughing or sneezing. These are strategies you as an individual can take to prevent transmission, to reduce contact rates in the population. And so, again, this is just to highlight that maybe the concept has changed, but for now, it's not super important because the term is misleading for both. Even if if the concept has changed, the term is misleading. If either one of them is the concept, the term is misleading. And so let's look at this. So why is social distancing misleading? Well, social distancing is not distancing oneself socially. Unlike sexual harassment, where what's sexual harassment? Well, it's a harassment that's sexual. Social distancing is not distancing that is social. In fact, this shares more with like shooting star or morning star. In fact, kind of literally, because these are words that gained their meaning back at a time when people like really didn't know better or didn't care about more. So what happened with social distancing is when it was coined, it was talking about strategies that were being used in 2002 and 2003 in Southeast Asia. This is a place where like the physical was the social. We didn't have the opportunity to have Zoom meetings like we did, where like you could conflate the physical and the social because there wasn't a meaningful distance between them, or at least there wasn't as meaningful of a distance between them as there is. So, and also like terms in technical settings tend to be really sticky. We tend to use the language of the people before us, both to show allegiance and show that we know, but also it helps us communicate like which literatures are together. By using social distancing, because the other person uses social distancing, you're signaling that social distance, that you're talking about the same thing. And so in this way, I think this explains why social distancing stuck around for 15 years in the epidemiological literature without changing, or without being changed to physical distancing, whereas the WHO in 2 months into the outbreak stopped using social distancing and started using physical distancing. But anyway, social distancing is not distancing oneself socially. And so you get this, but if you imagine people encountering the word for the first time, people who aren't specialists, people who don't have knowledge of epidemiological concepts, they hear this phrase social distancing and they're forced to infer what is it that they're talking about. They're forced to try to form a concept based on what they're talking about. And so you end up, if they interpret it literally as you would notebook or apartment block and not like shooting star, you get this mismatch between what is apt to be inferred from the meaning and what people mean by it. So the descriptive interpretation, that is interpreting it as distancing as social, excludes things like interactions in non-social spaces, such as gas stations, grocery stores, and hospitals. We don't think of going to the grocery store as a social thing, a social event, but nonetheless, that's definitely a place where contact could happen and spread could happen. Also, solo activities in crowded places. If I go on a solo walk on a crowded footpath, that is bad social distancing, but I am in some sense distancing myself socially. Similarly, it improperly includes certain behavior that for present purposes is fine, such as online social activities. Doing this right now is fine. It's social, sort of, and it's social distancing nonetheless. Or safe in-person social activities. I'm sure everyone here has run into someone at a grocery store and like yelled at each other from across the street, or talked to each other with a very careful 6-foot distance. So in this way, there's this disconnect between what can be inferred and what can't. And I want to be really careful here, especially since we're all philosophers. Without empirical work, it's impossible to know how much what sort of confusion and how much confusion this actually caused. It's impossible to know exactly we don't have the methodological resources to go in and say, hey, look, I can armchair my way through this. This must have caused all sorts of confusion. We can't armchair our way through this and say, hey, this is what caused those people to hide out in the Scottish Highlands because they were social distancing, but they were distancing themselves socially, but they weren't really social distancing. So I really want to highlight that with this sort of thing, we have to be really careful about how exactly is it that we think that a word causes mental representations in other people. So with this all said, what is the function of social distancing? Well, it's something like reducing contact rates in populations. We'll take the epidemiologists at their word for how they define it. And so what we want out of the term is something that gives us internalized behaviors that reduce contact rates, such as staying indoors except going to the grocery store, that sort of thing. And so the term social distancing is misleading in this way in that it's not apt to cause these mental representations. It adds an extra step where people have to go, oh, it's not what I might think it is, it's this other thing, in the same way that like someone talks, you hear seahorse for the first time and there's this extra step where you have to go, wait, no, it's not a horse in the sea, it's a thing that looks like a horse. So with the verdict here, let's weigh it up. It's good that it's easy to remember. Social and distancing are both pretty common English words. It offers useful expressive power. It lets us talk about this thing that saves lives, has saved lives, and teach strategies for saving lives by giving it a name. And it uses the same vocabulary as experts. It lets us say, hey, look, I'm using social distancing in the same way as they've been using, roughly. That's great, right? I'm not misusing language in the same way that coronavirus is misusing language. But the bad side is it's misleading in the way I've described above, where it's apt to cause false or misleading mental representations. And so like there's two then, given the function we should care about. Given that we want to cause good behavior in people, it's good that it offers expressive power for communicating this, but it's bad that it's misleading. But notice then that like social distancing, the phrase social distancing, isn't unique in its power, in its expressive power here. We just need some name for it. And so the fact that social distancing offers expressive power is really a contingent fact, and one that we kind of disregard is not something inherently valuable in the phrase social distancing. So really the only thing that matters here is that it's misleading for the function of reducing contact rates in the population. So really social distancing should have been dropped. And it's hard to blame epidemiologists for, I think it's sort of, in some ways this is predictable with hindsight, but I want to caution people about how exactly we do this and say that this is like a fundamentally empirical question of whether or not terms will be misleading when they hit the general public. So just to wrap up now, that's the meat of it. That's the epidemiological meat. I just want to sort of wrap up by summarizing a bit of what I said and tying it in with conceptual engineering, give sort of broader lessons for the conceptual engineer. Conceptual engineers should focus on the function of language, and most of the function they've been focusing on so far is this idea of like institutional power of the word. In fact, there's this other really important function, which is the decipherability or avoiding misleadingness. How much is it that the term is apt to be a good vehicle for the concept you want it to be a concept for? We don't want to call a herd of cats the coronavirus, because that would be terribly misleading. We don't want to call our new concept of marriage cancer, because that would be terribly misleading. And so we should think about, in sort of more robust ways, the ways in which like the language itself communicates information to people we're trying to spread the concepts or meanings we want to too. Second, depending on the desired function of language, literal truthfulness is not always necessary here. So we shouldn't really care if our engineering leads to something false, if in this case, the function of the word we're aiming for is sort of falseness indifferent, as is the case with coronavirus, where we're just trying to impart certain ideas into people. It doesn't matter whether or not what we say is with the word is literally true or false. Finally, labels for a concept in one setting or meaning in one setting may not work in another. So in this case, a label that worked in epidemiology because epidemiologists had the expertise and time to sort through and make sure that they were learning exactly what social distancing was, doesn't work in the non-specialized setting when we're suddenly like, social distancing, we have to do it. What do we do? Can we go to the beaches? Can we go to the highlands? And so we need to think about how it is that we're blind to sort of to our social group, or what the social group are trying to spread it to, how they think. And this is not work we can do. This is something we have to do with anthropologists, psychologists, marketing experts, linguists, people like that, people who have this these methods that are capable of really looking in and thinking about how people who don't think like us will think about certain language. And that's it. Thank you.